Regulations. Earlier in this chapter, we discussed how interdependent utility or production functions can cause the externalization of costs. Uh, Nuisance suits provide a remedy. State regulations provide another remedy. Regulations restrict the use of the property without taking title from the owner. Enacting regulations involves a political fight between the beneficiaries and the victims. Since the outcome depends on politics, not cost benefit analysis, the total cost of regulations often exceed the total benefits. However, a chapter on property is not the place to develop a full critique of regulations. In this section, we focus on a narrower issue related to takings. Regulations typically cause a fall in the value of some target property, which may prompt a suit for compensation. To illustrate, an industrialist who acquires land to build a factory may be blocked when the local government downzones and forbids industrial uses. The industrialist may sue, alleging that the state took a substantial portion of the value of the property, but not the title. When courts find for the plaintiff in such cases, they say there was a taking. When courts find for the defendant in such cases, they say there was a regulation. The difference is that a taking requires compensation and a regulation requires no compensation. We want to discuss the incentive effects of this classification into compensated restrictions, takings, and uncompensated restrictions, regulations. Again, that sentence is we want to discuss the incentive effects of this classification into compensated restrictions, takings, and uncompensated restrictions, regulations. If the state need not compensate for regulations, then it will not impose too many of them. If there are too many restrictions, then resources will not be put to their highest valued use. This uncompensated restriction, thus uncompensated restrictions, result in inefficient uses. Conversely, if the state must compensate fully for restrictions, then property owners will be indifferent about whether the state restricts them. If property owners are indifferent about whether the state restricts them, they will improve their property as if there were no risk that restrictions will prevent the use of the improvements. If restrictions subsequently prevent the use of the improvements, the investment will be wasted. Thus, compensated restrictions result in wasteful improvements. We illustrate this argument by an example, superscript 65, which reads, see Cooter, Unity and Tort, Contract and Property. The model of precaution 73 Cal L Rev 1 open 180 1985 close. Again, that is 73 cal dot L dot Rev dot 1 open parentheses 1985 close parentheses. Back to the text. Facts. Xavier is a government official whose wall contains a map with a thick blue line across it. Currently, the land use planning laws allow the area to the south of the blue line to be used for any commercial, industrial, or residential purpose. The government proposes to change the law and forbid industrial uses, although commercial uses would still be allowed. Yvonne owns a building that is located on the Blue Line. She currently uses the building as a retail outlet, but she is contemplating expanding and improving the building for use as a factory. Yvonne must decide how much to invest in improving her building. If she abandons the idea of using her building as a factory, she will make a smaller investment in improving it for use as retail space. And the government's land use regulation decision will not affect her. But if she proceeds with the idea of using her building as a factory, she will make a large investment, and the government's decision will affect her. Should the government carry out its proposed change, she will lose money on the large investment, and a court will then have to decide whether she is entitled to compensation for the loss. The decision will turn on whether the court declares the change in the governmental land use plan to be a regulation, in which case no compensation is due, or a taking, in which case compensation is due. Consider the incentive effects of the court's decision on Yvonne. If she is confident that downzoning is a taking and that she will receive compensation, she bears no risk from making a large investment. So she will invest as if there were no risk of loss from governmental action. On the other hand, if she is confident that downzoning is a regulation and that she will not receive compensation, she bears the risk that the value of her investment would be destroyed by the governmental action. And she will restrain her investment. Figure 5.2 on page 174 illustrates these facts. The vertical axis indicates dollars, and the horizontal axis measures the size of Yvonne's renovated building. The straight line labeled total cost indicates the amount that she spends on enlarging the building. Two curves labeled big R sub NR and big R sub R indicate possible revenues yielded by the building as a function of its size. The higher revenue curve, labeled big R sub NR, indicates the revenues obtainable when there is no regulation, so that the building can be used as a factory. The lower revenue curve, labeled big R sub R, indicates the revenues obtainable when there is regulation, so that the building cannot be used as a factory. Applying the usual economic logic, Yvonne will maximize profits by choosing the size of the building for which the marginal cost equals the marginal revenues. Marginal values are given by the slopes of total value curves in the graph. Y sub naught is the point at which the slope of the lower revenue curve equals the slope of the total cost curve. So Y sub naught is the profit maximizing investment level when industrial use is forbidden. If Yvonne were certain that the court would hold that downzoning as a regulation, then she would maximize profits by investing at the low level y sub naught. Y sub 1 is the point at which the slope of the higher revenue curve equals the slope of the total cost curve. So y sub 1 is the profit maximizing investment level when industrial use is allowed. If Yvonne were certain that downzoning would be deemed a taking by the court, she would maximize profits, including compensation, by investing at the high level. Now consider the efficient level of investment. Social efficiency requires Yvonne to take account of real risks, including the risk that the value of her contemplated investment will be destroyed by governmental action. If it were certain that the government would not alter the land use regulations in this area, then efficiency would require Yvonne to invest at the high level, y sub 1. On the other hand, if it were certain that government would alter the rules, then efficiency would require Yvonne to invest at the low level y sub naught. In reality, it is uncertain whether government will make the alteration. So efficiency requires Yvonne to invest at a level in between y sub 1 and y sub naught. Superscript 66, which reads, to be precise, efficiency requires her to make additional improvements until the resulting increase in her profits when there is no government action, multiplied by the probability of no governmental action, equals the loss in profits where there is government action, multiplied by the probability of governmental action. Back to the text. No compensation causes Yvonne to internalize the risk. When she internalizes the risk, she invests efficiently at a level above y sub naught and below y sub 1. We conclude that no compensation for the loss of value in investments caused by uncertain governmental action provides incentives for efficient private investment. However, compensation causes her to invest at y sub 1 as if the risk were zero. We conclude that full compensation for the loss of value in investments caused by uncertain governmental action provides incentives for excessive private investment. This argument concerns incentives for private persons, not the state. The effect of the two legal institutions, regulations and takings, is quite different when we turn from private persons to government officials. If the court decides that the alteration in the allowable uses of land in the relevant area is a mere regulation, so that compensation need not be paid, then the alteration costs the government nothing. On the other hand, if the court decides that this particular action is a taking, so that the compensation must be paid, then this type of action is very costly to the government. Obviously, the non compensability of regulations gives government officials an incentive to overregulate, whereas the compensability of takings makes the government officials internalize the full cost of expropriating private property. When government action is likely to be judged a taking, the government internalizes the cost of its actions and thus restrains its taking of private property. On the other hand, when the government action is likely to be judged a mere regulation, the government lacks material incentives to conserve its use of viable property rights. If the state compensates property owners for governmental takings, property owners have an incentive toward excessive improvements, whereas if the state does not compensate, the government has an incentive to overregulate private property. This is the paradox of compensation, which we shall meet again in our study of contracts and torts. Officials should consider this paradox when they must decide whether a state action that reduces private property values is a taking or a regulation. If private owners will respond to compensation by making excessive improvements, then their behavior will improve by declining the state action to be a regulation. Conversely, if the government will respond to non compensation by excessive action that harms property owners, then its behavior will improve by declaring the state action to be a taking. In technical terms, elasticity in the supply of private investment with respect to compensation favors regulation instead of takings, and elasticity in the supply of state action with respect to compensation favors takings instead of regulations. WebNote 5.9. There have been some fascinating recent U.S. cases regarding non compensable regulations and compensable takings. We review some of those cases and some of the recent literature on these issues on our website.